welcome to this episode of Timeless Topics. This is part one in a two-part series on the importance of universal precautions to prevent re-traumatizing those we serve and serve with. In this episode, we discuss everything from vulnerability to debriefing to quantifying the suffering of others. We're so excited you're back with us for these spicy discussions, so let's go ahead and jump in.
But it does feel akin to that, like this three totally different people, different walks of life, some overlap, like it's not three separate circles. There is a Venn diagram, but you get in this place where you're like, oh, but that overlap might be more than I think it is,
Yeah.
which I
Well, and
think
I
is what's
think
missing in a
that's
lot of, spaces.
right, exactly. I was going to say, I think that's a very important part of life that we are underestimating is no matter how separate we may seem or maybe how different we may seem, there's always going to be a tiny piece that overlaps. And you may have to search for that piece. But if you don't sit and have an honest, open conversation, you'll never find that peace. You will always think that we are in two separate realms, and that is so not the case, right? And I think we underestimate the benefit of this debriefing time, even, right? I had a situation at work and I called or texted a friend as I was leaving work, and I was like, I know it's early, but are you awake? I need an emergency debrief. And she jumped on a call with me immediately. She's like, okay, what happened? And it's like, what had happened was, and I just needed to spill it. And she just sat and she listened. She didn't really say much of anything. She just listened and let me vent. And at the end of it, she was like, now, do you feel better? I was like, actually, I do, because I was this close to tears and I couldn't get into my car with my spouse and go home with that weight on my chest because I was going to snap at him. Right. And she was like, and I knew that. She was like, so now you can go home, you can have breakfast, get a shower, and go sleep, and it will be better. And I was like, you're right, it will be better. But how many times do we just kind of take it and own it and walk into our homes or the rest of our personal life, right? And know that the snapping, the shortness, the anger, the tears are not really appropriate for those around us, but rather an extension of the fact that we didn't release that whatever situation we were in.
Can I follow up with that?
Mhm.
Because I mean, we're just falling off of Thanksgiving, and you just made me think of a couple of times when just over the holiday, you know how sometimes you don't even know that you've got shadows that you've kind of stuffed in the closet a little bit, and certain things in real time happen, and you're actually responding to a shadow version of that situation. And that happened a couple of times because I had the grands and stuff like that. And I, gosh, golly, I love them all. And, it feels so blessed that they all want to come and hang out with Mimi and stuff. But in my isolation, when it's just me and my husband, I forget about those shadows. And so then when they come and knock in, and I mean, I wish I could say I respond, but what I've noticed now, kind of rewinding the tape, that is I was reacting, and my daughter, kind of afterwards was like, "Why are you mad at us? Why? What did we do?" And because I've kind of been in this phase now, really trying to be more mindful, and I feel like I have this space and grace to do that. I was noticing like what is happening, like who's doing this conversation right now, kind of a thing. And I was able to at least, I haven't unbundled the whole bit of it, but I was at least able to say that what I just observed, actually, I found it triggering to something else that is in the shadows that I can't really describe in great detail. And I don't want to harbor it. I don't want to try and push it back down, kind of like what I remember when you were sharing your story, what I would try and just swallow all of that, distress that I experienced at the end of a shift. and not realize that it was actually squirting out all over. It was like a fire hose all over everybody in the aftermath of that, because I didn't have the opportunity to discharge like what you had done in real time. And so I think like while we have those specific examples in our clinical work that we're able to, because it feels so discreet and live, and I think there is more conversation about the importance of debriefing, right? So we've kind of like de-taboofied it, if that's even a real word, um, is actually, for me at least, having these conversations about debriefing has actually helped me pull it in and figure out how do I debrief some of the other stuff that's been lurking in the shadows that, I mean, I'm Olympic level stuffer. And so I don't even know all of the stuff that's been squished into the nooks and crannies. And so being able to begin to process that has been really helpful. I mean, I wish I didn't have to, do that, but I think some of the conversations that we've had collectively, because they're so spontaneous and organic and just fluid, it's given me kind of almost permission to not feel like I have to withhold, that I have to constrain stuff, not just with you guys, but because it feels so good and safe in this space that we've created, that I've kind of like, put my arm around that, and I kind of carry it with me. I hope this makes a little bit of sense. But I love what you shared, and I love the value of that. And I hope folks that can listen to this can see that it's not just these discrete moments. They're wicked important, and absolutely, but there are other moments when we can feel overwhelmed and like on the edge. And so, figuring out ways that we can process some of that in a safe space is important too.
No, no, I really like that. And I like what you said about how, this connection, this setting has opened up to other aspects of life, right? Because I didn't really think about that until you said it. And then I was like, yeah, because it has gotten to the point that I'm like, okay, well, instead of me sitting here and just stewing on whatever, let's try to have a conversation about it, right? And hopefully, as you mentioned, for those listening, it may seep out to that. It's like, we can have these dialogues and it can be respectful, it can be honest. At times it can be stressful. It can be scary,
Yeah.
right? But the benefit that you get from it, and then it just becomes a little bit easier every time. And it's like, let's start it and let's see what happens, right? The worst that can happen is that the person you're talking to may not really be as into it as you are, but okay, then that just means there's somebody else who wants to hear it,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
I think of debriefing as therapy in the workspace, especially in healthcare where we're rife for secondary trauma and all those things. And sure, there's the analytical kind of debrief where we're trying to find the systems gaps and all those things, but you can't ignore the personal experience of the situation that required the debrief, you know what I mean? And the personal experience is honestly what triggered the call for the debrief, right? And so leaning into both sides of it, I think provides a lot of insight, not only into the systems and all the opportunities for change, but also the system of the team and how well each individual person is playing and supporting each other, and find your gaps there or your strengths or both, right? Because most of the time there's both that exist. You did something really well and then maybe something that could have gone a little bit differently, and now we can learn and take it to the next experience, right? Commonly when I speak or when I talk with somebody, I get asked a lot, like, how are you so comfortable with being uncomfortable? And I tell people trauma is the answer. My life has been full of a lot of privilege, but also a lot of trauma. And I think my self recovery of all of that work has made me willing to sit in some pretty deep, dark places that are not comfortable with anybody who will ask me to accompany them there, because I've had to do most of that work alone. And learning how to do it alone gives you a skill set to help other people when they're ready. And recognizing those triggers, recognizing those things. Sometimes my hypervigilance from, y'all remember my ACE score is 7, right? So I've lived a life. But a lot of times my hypervigilance will pick up on people's triggers before they do.
Mhm.
And so I'll be like, oh, we're not talking about this anymore. We're talking about something entirely different that happened to you in like 4th grade. And they'll be like, what are you talking about? And then they'll come back and be like, yeah, okay. Yeah, you were right. And I was like, it's not about me being right. It's about recognizing that we all have a list of past experiences and we're all the culmination of all of our past experiences, good and bad.
Mhm.
And while I didn't choose to have any score of 7 or live the traumatic life that I've had in the ways in which I've experienced it, I have found a way to turn that experience into something that benefits myself and other people, whether it's my immediate family, my kids, or whether it's the people that I provide nursing professional development to, people that I'm in community with. And it is a hard earned badge, if you will. But once you embrace it, it really just opens up so much of the world that we tend to close off because we're afraid of discomfort. And I know it's, my mantra to keep repeating it, but like we have to get comfortable with being uncomfortable. Like there's no other way to live authentically. Because without that, you're just living and playing a part that you think is okay for somebody else, and you're denying whatever you're actually experiencing or believe or thinking or whatever verb you want to attach to that.
I love that you mentioned, how did you phrase it? That many of the things that compel us to the debrief is often an interpersonal kind of a situation. And I think that really just calls out the fact that you might think that these are things that only happen in the clinical sphere, but the you that shows up to your life every day, whether you're on the unit, at the supermarket, in your house, is that same you who has certain predilections towards different situations. You have built-in responses and reactions to different situations, based on your own lived experience, based on your own life, trials, tribulations, the whole, triumphs, the whole kit and caboodle. And so I think, one of the things that has at least been helpful for me, I mean, although I didn't really make this discovery full on until after I left the bedside, but really kind of, having that space to see it, I realized that a lot of the ways that I showed up was basically a mirror, maybe a reflection of other encounters that I had, not necessarily clinical, but the clinical situations aren't any different than every other day, right? You're interacting with a variety of different people from a variety of different backgrounds with a variety of different situations. Kind of maybe the anchoring reality is the medical trauma, is that, life-threatening situation. Um, but that's kind of just the almost like the stage setup, if you will. And I don't mean that in a minimizing way, but that's just that particular forum where people are drawn together. But it still is grounded in interpersonal interactions that revolve and spin off of stress, anxiety, fear, all of the things that we experience in that setting. And so I think it's important for folks to recognize that, because at least my experience, I used to think I was controlling it all. Like I thought I was showing up to work and I was putting on my clinical hat and nothing else mattered. Like the me that lived at home, that lived outside of the unit was a completely different person. But I wasn't, but I deluded myself into thinking that way because it gave me a sense of control, that was obviously artificially manufactured. I never liked being uncomfortable. And so, kind of that intensive care environment with all the protocols and all that kind of structure gave me a sense of security that I think, I mean, it's, the structure's there, but I think it was really a facade. I think, I used it as a vehicle to give myself that sense of stability and security. but it really, I think it was just a little bit make believe. Does that make sense?
Yeah, we hide behind the titles, the roles, the hierarchy. We hide behind all of it, right? Because in plain sight, because if you've worked with the team long enough, you know everybody's strengths and weaknesses.
Yeah.
And so, yes, that's just the nature of being a human, but we also hide behind them before we talk about either other specialties, maybe people who don't know our strengths and weaknesses the same way, or families, where we'll say things like, well, I follow the evidence and this is what we're going to do. And you're like, based on whose interpretation? Like, what? That's a wild sentence to say out loud, you know? Because I would argue you're actually not following the evidence, but okay. So it's just this place of we have to buffer ourselves, and from some sense, like I do get it, right? What we do is hard, where we're walking in the midst of a broken system, right, that's been crumbling for decades. And we're supporting a family through a traumatic event, which is full of a variety of emotions, right, positive and negative. And we're expected to just do it while also monitoring how quickly we document something and did we clock in and how many CEs have we done and all of this, like to the 15 minutes of everything of our life. Like, and we need to kind of step away from that sometimes because there's only so much a person can do. Whereas I think, sure, step away, but also maybe consider step forward. Like lean into the fact that you're a human and a team full of humans, because we haven't been replaced with robots yet. They're trying, but we're all still here. So then why can't we collect and like lean on the collective strength of the group from an interhuman perspective that they can't replicate no matter how hard they try, right? Because I've been in situations where I don't know how we would have gotten out of it if it weren't the 5 people in that on that team. Like if one other person had been subbed, I can't guarantee the outcome would have been the same.
Mm.
And now is that luck? Is that skill? Is it a mix of both? Probably. But it's also just like, but I also knew from like a universal sense that we were meant to be the team that responded to this particular situation. So then things went well because we were there, we were worked together, we were there, that we were meant to be locked in for this particular family story. And leaning into the strength of that, I think, is at least part of the motivation to continue doing this work rather than just give in to the robots and the checklist and the, AI into Epic and all the things, right? Like, it's hard. AI is coming for us all. Like, I'm a very late adopter. I'm very resistant to all of it for a lot of reasons. But I just worry that we're giving so much credit to something without a heart and a soul to be able to interpret stuff that requires a heart and a soul to interpret.
You're making me think of Dan Siegel, wrote this really cool book. It was called Intra-Connected, and he coined this new word, well, air quotes here, new word, MWE, MWE. And he talks about, that I'm not sure what term he uses, but that I'm a me, but I'm also part of a we. And so we need to kind of, because I think he's really responding to this extreme isolationism, in the world. And when we do this kind of extreme isolation, it actually can foster, hyper competitiveness and, that binary perspective, good, bad, win lose, all that zero sum kind of game business versus I'm a me, but I'm also part of a we and getting comfortable with that recognition. And that if we can really move back into that space, I'm super paraphrasing his work right now, okay? But if we can get back into that space, a lot of the challenges and struggles and hate and discord that is so rampant in our current society could possibly dissipate, because we see ourselves in that shared space and not these, silos. So
We're going to escape back to something that you said, and this completely my ignorance in this topic. You mentioned an ACE score of 7.
mm,
How the crap do you know that? Right? And is that something that we should all know about ourselves, right? I think we have a general sense, well, maybe some of us do, of trauma, right? Of things that have impacted our life positively, negatively. I think some of us would be surprised at some of the things that we thought were very normal, to realize that they probably had more of an impact on our life than we thought. Um, and it just makes me stop and think that well, okay, several thoughts. One, you have to be really careful with it, right? Because if somebody's not really aware, and then all of a sudden they're handed this, and again, ignorance, forgive me, I don't even know the range, but it's like, your score's 25. And I'm sitting here thinking, I thought I was okay. And now you're telling me I'm not,
Mhm.
right? And then would that make me have a different sense about myself, my life, or whatever? So I think you have to be really careful with that. But would it make a difference in how we interact with our families, right? If we knew that about ourselves, as well as if maybe somebody knew that about them. I don't think we all need to know. Because one of the things that happens, I always come with a clinical story, but one of the things is sitting and watching how we talk, because I don't want to blame anybody else. I'm going to say we, but how we talk about some of our families and aspects that really have absolutely no medical impact on their child. There's some things that I do think are helpful for us to know about our families and how we interact with them, and other aspects that I don't think we need to know that. But where is that balance and where is that line, right? Um, how much of it, while maybe not medically impacting the baby, will impact our emotional support of the family, for lack of better word.
Yeah.
Um, if all of that makes sense, because I know right now I'm just kind of rambling, but
Yeah, I've got a lot of thoughts on this.
okay.
Um,
Okay.
So first, to address the ACE score. So it's adverse childhood experiences. It came out of a study in the 90s by Felitti from the CDC and Kaiser Permanente, and they screened a very large group of population, and they found that 70% had at least one adverse childhood experience. And as you got up in numbers, it correlated with chronic health conditions and public health conditions, things like diabetes, cancer, stroke, suicidality, even in the absence of risk-taking behavior. So it meant that something happened in some context. It was correlative data, not causative, right? But it correlated enough to say, well, perhaps we should take care of our children, because if we take care of our children, we're taking care of our future. And of course, it didn't quite go that way, right? People were just like, oh, it's not my problem. But the thing is, the study was 70% Caucasian, 70% college educated. If it was them, it was everybody, right? Based on what we know about all the structural pervasiveness of racism and prejudice and everything, right? So when you're looking at your ACE, it's a cumulative score of 10, and it's just 1 point for each one you've experienced. So it's child physical, emotional, or sexual abuse, physical or emotional neglect, because those are different than abuse, living with a family member with mental illness or substance use disorder, incarcerated relative, the mother treated violently, although it's inherently gendered. I do think it's better to think of it as primary caregiver treated violently, and then death or divorce. And it's not that divorce is necessarily a absolutely negative thing. It's the way that co-parenting happens after that. If it's a feeling of abandonment by a parent, basically. And when you think about that, you can end up with a pretty high ACE score for the average person. When I talk about this, sometimes I'll have clinicians, God love research-driven clinicians, and they'll say, well, we should be getting ACE scores on everybody that walks in the NICU. And I was like, cool, what's yours? And then it gets personal, and now they don't like it. And first of all, I do not rush to quantify. You never rush to quantify without a safety plan, because you're just supposed to ask somebody and have them tell you that their ACE score is 9, and then you just go, okay, and then walk away. Like, no, absolutely not. And I had to put my foot down at one organization, because I was like, no, we are not doing that. Now, if you can present me a safety plan and we can figure out what happens with this data and how we're going to protect this data, because just as you mentioned, we do need to be cautious about what we know about families, because we're invoking bias at that point. And we're having people think that it's okay that because you have an ACE score of 7, that you're automatically just doomed, right? Because while I'm vocal about my 7, I also think that I'm a fairly successful, well-adjusted person. Took me a lot of work and access and privilege to get here, but I want to share how I did it and what I did with other people so that they can realize that it's not a death score. You're not doomed just because you have a higher ACE score that you're all of a sudden going to amount to nothing and your life is going to be dark and twisted, you know? As a lifelong goth kid, my life is dark and twisted, but that's by choice, okay? So the other thing has nothing to do with this, but I do appreciate the inquisitiveness of it, right? Because it does help give us a snapshot, maybe, into someone's existence. It's just, I worry about the combination of curiosity and hubris in medicine might get us to some pretty harmful places disproportionately for communities that have been disproportionately harmed and left out of, privilege and help for too long already. And I worry that it would end up being in the wrong hands, be used in an inappropriate way.
And I think the thing that you're really calling out there too is that, as identifying an A score, you hope will then roll into being exposed to or cared with a trauma-informed mindset, right? And being trauma-informed is not about summing up the suffering. Just as you said, it's not like, oh, I'm so sorry, you're screwed, you're a 7, boom, and throwing the baby out with the bathwater. And also to kind of follow up on that numerical thing, because I know out in the West Coast, there is more of a intentionality around curating that information. My question around that is, what is the relevance of that? Are you going to respond then to the associated phenomena that are a consequence of having that level of exposure to early life adversity, and you're going to intervene? Or, as you kind of alluded to, Jessi, or is it just this morbid curiosity about, well, I'm not as screwed up as you, so that makes me feel better? Or does it continue to perpetuate the biases? The general consensus, at least in my limited experience with this work, is that we really need to treat people's stories with universal precautions. I mean, if the one thing that we learned from the ACE study, that Felitti study that was published, it was 98 when that paper came out. So that's a long time ago, and it's been replicated across a variety of other demographics in different countries and all of the things, because it was very homogeneous. It's the results stand firm. We know that individuals with adversity during early life are at higher risk for a myriad of, adult morbidities, up to and including cancer, shortened lifespan, suicidality, all of the things that Jessi mentioned. And so if it is so pervasive, which the data can, protests and confirms, then wouldn't universal precautions then work? And so, I really think that, and there's really some really good publications that really talk about the importance of that approach. We do that with so many other phenomena, right? That there's a universal approach to, bloodborne infections, and all of these other things that are just, we've already adapted our mindset to that approach to medical care. So why can't we do the same? But with a more deeper understanding of, not just broad brushing, like what I don't know won't hurt me, and so I'm just going to treat you just like I would want to be treated, which may or may not work for you, right? Because you don't look like me, perhaps, you have other needs. So really getting folks to have this broader, I hope this doesn't sound pie in the sky, unbiased, potentially even, understanding of those that they're called to serve and interact with on a daily basis could really be a cornerstone for a new healthcare, a new way of responding and interacting with individuals that's not just about their disease, but about the wholeness of who they are in the moment that they're enduring this, medical crisis.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Timeless Topics. We welcome your feedback and suggestions, so please reach out. Our handle on all social media platforms is @TimelessTopicsNICU, and our email address is timelesstopicsnicu@gmail.com. See you next time.